Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This week's video is one that's actually been requested for quite a bit. A while ago I covered the Telltale Walking Dead video games and covered a lot of their cut content, and I asked what other series you would like me to check out. And overwhelmingly, people told me I should check out The Wolf Among Us. Now this is a game that I actually hadn't played before, and I didn't really know much about going in, but I totally get why it's got such a strong fandom behind it. And I figured with a sequel in the works, why not go over its cut content? So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, the only issue that I encountered as someone who's fairly new to this game is that there's not too much cut content from the sources that I usually use, and a lot of the more in-depth stuff has been covered by experts on this game. I've seen quite a few video essays that comb through a lot of data, and they get individual interviews with the developers and things like that, stuff that I just, with the size of this channel, don't have access to. So I'm going to be looking at some other cut content pieces that you may not have heard of, certain animations, certain lost characters, things like that. The Wolf Among Us was developed in 2013 through 2014 by Telltale Games. It's related to the Fables comic book series, however, it's said to take place in a separate universe. The game is set in 1986 and is a very interesting take on these sort of fables and fairy tale characters. The game has 5 episodes, however, when doing my research, most of the cut content revolves around the first 3 episodes. It appears that by episodes 4 and 5, they had a lot of things ironed out. And as we know from my discussions from Life is Strange, as well as the other Telltale games, that episode to episode, things can change. They aren't all developed at once and then released. It's developed over the course of those years and released every once in a while. So there were things that could have been changed in the next episode that they wound up not going that route, and it just appears that episodes 4 and 5 were fairly ironed out by the time that they got to that point of development. You play as Bigby Wolf, the sheriff of Fabletown. One of the things that's very charming about this game is reading off stuff like this. Ichabod Crane was deputy mayor and Snow White was his secretary. And of course, you investigate a murder, which takes you all across Fabletown, and you get to meet all sorts of characters from various different fairy tales and stories. And it's all a very interesting, very dark take on this sort of thing. I don't know what the proper phrase would be, but I really enjoy the style of it. So let's get into the cut content. The first big thing is the plot of the game used to be quite a bit different. One of the big plot elements from an early version of the game was that Cinderella's stepsister was one of the victims of the murders. They actually wound up storyboarding this idea, and it got fairly far into production. However, ultimately it was cut in favor of the plot that we ended up getting. In this version of the game, you would not have only played as Bigby, but also as Cinderella and even Mr. Toad. It leads me to believe that this version of the story would have Cinderella be a direct suspect for the murder of her stepsister, and you would sort of play as her to try to prove her innocence. Or maybe if she was somehow involved, it would be kind of a heavy rain situation where you don't realize it, but really you are, and whatever, and... the origami killer. Anyway. The Kelsey Brannigan storyline is one that was very well covered by a lot of YouTubers. When I did my research into this, this is the one that was covered by a ton of people in very long videos, and so I didn't want to beat a dead horse or have people feel like I was copying or stealing. It's the same reason I haven't covered season 4 of The Walking Dead. It's something that has been covered by one person, and if I wanted sources on it, I would have to go to that one person, and then I would just be regurgitating pretty much exactly what they said. So, but to briefly discuss it, this character, Kelsey, was meant to be a larger role in the story, and the police would gradually get closer and closer to uncovering the mysterious existence of Fabletown. However, this role was reduced heavily after several rewrites. If you want to find a more in-depth version of that storyline, it's been covered to death. The real trouble with this, before we get into the cut characters and then the individual episodes, is that a lot of stuff was reworked. A lot of things were changed in development, and we know that simply because of the nature of video game development, but also because of developer testimony, things like that. The only problem is a lot of it really just isn't reported on. A lot of people haven't really spoken about the specifics of it. Now, whether that's because this game has become more of a cult classic, or because the sequel is in development and maybe they're going to reuse certain plot threads and things like that, I can't really say. Next, we're going to get into the unused characters of The Wolf Among Us. Now, obviously, we just mentioned her storyline that was cut involving her stepsister, and that she was at one point a playable character. In the final game, she can be seen plenty of times, however, she can't really be interacted with. Along with the storyboards related to the murder of the stepsisters, we also have some images of Cinderella within her apartment with two figures that we can't really identify. I believe this could be a remnant of an early test of her storyline. When you get as far as storyboarding, you begin to sort of plot things out in the game. It could be one of those things where they put placeholder characters in just to run sequences to make sure it works, and this could easily be just a remnant of that, or maybe even an early diorama to one of the episodes that was ultimately changed. We also have an image of an early version of her character. Our next and final cut character is one that I think is actually a really interesting and fun idea, something I would like to see re-implemented in the future if they wanted to go this route. The Crier is a minor background character that doesn't really do much. He just happens to show up in very convenient places. It's really interesting what his original purpose in the story was. He was meant to be the boy who cried wolf, and he would have been Bigby's deputy. Isn't that just perfect? There's something so fun and cheeky about the boy who cried wolf in this sort of fantasy world being the detective's deputy. I mean, I can imagine the comedy, I can imagine for the drama, the investigation, that maybe one of the dynamics is that he jumps the gun on a lot of these evidence pieces, and that's kind of his problem, hence the boy who cried wolf thing, you know what I'm saying? I just feel like that's a gold mine for a character in this kind of unique world, and I feel like it's almost a missed opportunity. However, the reason they decided to remove him from the game in that capacity was so Bigby could be a sort of loner type character, which they felt matched better with the comics that these are inspired by. Now we're going to get into the cut content from a few of the episodes. In episode 1, when you're done dealing with the woodsman, the level was actually going to do something very, very interesting. The environment was going to turn into a sort of hub area, as it's described, where you would have to go around and attempt to clean up the mess as much as possible before a cop would eventually show up and ask you questions. You could hide or leave out as much as you wanted, and then eventually a cop would show up and ask you questions. Obviously, depending on how much you were able to hide and how much you were able to put away or clean up would have changed this dialogue. There's actually quite a few unused animations for this specific sequence. For example, there is an animation of throwing the woodsman in a dumpster, dragging Toad's car over the bloodstain, and making sure Toad stays inside or hiding him in the smashed car. There was a lot of thought put behind this sequence that was ultimately not used, and I actually really like this idea. It reminds me of certain sequences in The Walking Dead when you would have a sort of hub area and rations to give out, for example, and how you could do as little or as much as you wanted to, and it would affect the rest of the game. Clorinda's apartment is a section of the game that was completely cut. It's not in the base game at all. However, there's a list of animations and chores that would have been used within the apartment. There's a large list of things, and a lot of them are gibberish, just like enter 4, enter 3. Basically, from my understanding, these would just be different little interactables around the apartment. And the fact that we don't really have much of it left in the game files at all shows that some of these were placeholders, but there was definitely a plan. For example, there's one that says, Bigby crouch investigate bathroom chore, basically meaning that you would have been investigating this area and there were certain tick marks, certain invisible checkboxes you had to hit. like investigating the bathroom or using the sofa. In this same archive folder where these chore lists are, there's also a file referencing a very interesting mechanic that was cut from the game. The scent mechanic. This cut mechanic of scent would really play on the fact that Bigby Wolf was, a wolf. It would help you in investigations as well as most likely reading people. It wasn't fully implemented and there's not too much about it. However, one of the file names in this specific section is scent trail in that apartment. Basically saying you would be able to see these sort of scent icons, go over to it, and then use that ability to investigate that area. Out of fear of sounding like that one Arkham developer, it really makes you feel like a wolf. But being able to use that ability and sort of have an ability that feels like a bit more of a fairy tale thing, as grounded as this world is trying to be, I think that's a very interesting idea, and I really like that. Next, we're going to talk about Episode 2's cut content. First off, the interview with Detective Brannigan would have been much longer and a lot more intense. She would be a lot more combative and suspicious of Bigby than she is in the final game. She also would bring up things such as him having multiple birth certificates, as well as the fact that he's connected to Snow White. Instead of leaving when Crane knocks out the police officer, you would have actually been able to search for evidence relating to Fabletown in order to hide it. This is very similar to the mechanic from Episode 1 that is covering up the woodsman's, incident, and it would give you an opportunity to look around and try to cover all your bases, putting more responsibility on the player. If I leave behind that evidence, I know later when they find out about whatever, it's on me directly. Not just because the character happened to leave it. Georgie has an unused and much more cartoonish model than we see in the final game. However, it can actually be seen when going to the Puddin' and Pie in the alleyway. During the Witching Well segment, more characters were meant to be present. Characters such as Bluebeard, Mr. Toad, and TJ would have been present, and there's also cut dialogue to show this. This last one's a little silly. Lily's head would have been accidentally left at the police station, and Bigby would come up with the idea to, quote, glamour himself up as Detective Brannigan. Another interesting thing, once again relating back to Cinderella's cut role within this story, is that there's quite a few unused animations, at least the codes for them, that reference a fight between Cinderella and the Tweedle brothers. But this obviously never occurs. So it seems like this Cinderella storyline would have been running parallel with Bigby's story. And the list of them include things like Tweedle shoot Cindy, Cindy disarms Dumb, Cindy disarms Dumb 2, like there's multiple different iterations of them. And finally, the last piece of cut content from Episode 3 is not super huge, but it's interesting, and it relates to the diorama that was shown. A detective seen in Episode 2, in gym clothes, is holding a gun, watching Bigby enter the woodland. This is, once again, a remnant of the story focusing much more on the Mundys finding out about Fabletown, and is also most likely connected to the Cinderella story in some way. I would bet to say that the Cinderella storyline definitely has something to do with this early version of Bigby's storyline involving trying to keep Fabletown away from the Mundys and them playing a much larger role within the story. However, it was ultimately changed to depict Bigby chasing Crane's car, which is obviously what we see in the final game. It was really fun to explore this game. It's such a unique idea, and I'm very excited to see that it's being continued and that there's going to be a sequel. And it was a lot of fun to look into this stuff, and I really appreciate everybody for recommending the game, and I really hope you enjoy my cut content of it. I know there's not tons of it, and I would like to circle back for a theory deep dive video once I do a second playthrough or, something like that. Because there's a lot here, and I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope you have a good morning or evening or, whatever.